The loudest sound in the United States Senate isn't the roar of a protest or the bang of a gavel. It is the rhythmic, heavy thump of a Rhodes Scholar dropping 37 pages of tax fraud receipts onto a mahogany desk. Representative Ilhan Omar entered the Senate Judiciary Committee room that morning under the absolute delusion that she was the smartest person in the zip code. She walked with the practiced stride of the untouchable, shielded by the supposedly impenetrable armor of identity politics and a meticulously curated social media brand. To the squad members and the cameras trailing her, she was a pioneer of nuance and global complexity. To Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, she was simply a witness who had finally run out of runway. She sat down, adjusted her microphone with a flick of her wrist, and surveyed the room with the casual condescension of someone who believed the rules of political gravity applied only to others. She never saw the trap. She never noticed that the silver-haired, simple country lawyer at the end of the bench had spent the last 48 hours organizing an accordion file that contained the digital and physical autopsy of her entire career. The atmosphere shifted from routine bureaucracy to high-octane political theater the moment Omar decided to poke the lion. When Chairman Durbin gave Kennedy the floor for opening remarks, Omar couldn't resist a preemptive strike. Her voice, dripping with the kind of reflexive arrogance that comes from years of media protection, suggested that perhaps the senator from Louisiana should educate himself on the complexities of modern immigration and global politics before wasting time with his usual folksy dog and pony show. The room went dead silent. It was a fatal gambit. Kennedy didn't shout, he didn't even look surprised. He simply stopped mid-reach for his microphone, slowly removed his reading glasses with the surgical precision of an executioner, and smiled. It was a slow, terrifying grin. The smile of a predator that had just realized the prey had walked directly into the kill zone. He let the silence stretch for 15 agonizing seconds. The cameras caught every bead of sweat on the foreheads of her staff. Finally, Kennedy spoke, his voice thick with the deceptive sweetness of Southern molasses. "Well now, Congresswoman, I do appreciate you saving us all some time by grading my homework before I've even opened the book. That's mighty efficient of you." Kennedy proceeded to dismantle her intellectual superiority by calmly listing his credentials: honors from the University of Virginia, a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, 20 years of high-stakes legal practice. Then he delivered the first blow. He asked where she got her law degree. The silence was deafening because everyone in the room knew the answer. "Oh, that's right," Kennedy drawled. "You don't have one. You have a bachelor's degree from North Dakota State. Fine school, I'm sure. But I'm having a little trouble understanding why someone with a bachelor's degree from North Dakota State is lecturing a Rhodes Scholar about education. Maybe you can explain that to me slowly. Use small words so my simple Southern mind can follow along." The simple Southern hick persona was gone, replaced by a relentless prosecutor who made it clear that while Omar played at politics for the cameras, Kennedy played for keeps. He leaned back in his chair, patting the massive accordion file on his desk. It made a satisfying, hollow thump that echoed like a funeral drum. Inside that file, Kennedy announced, was a whole mess of facts. Bank records, tax filings, immigration documents, marriage certificates, and translations of speeches she had given in Somali, assuming that simple Americans wouldn't bother to translate them. He told the room that before the day was over, they would find out just how educated she really was regarding basic American laws on campaign finance, tax fraud, and ethics violations. The trap was not just set. It was already closing. Kennedy reached for the first tab in his file, his demeanor returning to a deceptive friendliness that was even more terrifying than his cold glare. He began with the concept of money, specifically the nearly $3 million that had flowed from Omar's campaign coffers into the consulting firm owned by her husband, Tim Minette. He held up a thick stack of FEC filings, letting the sheer volume of the paperwork speak for itself. He mused aloud about the comprehensive consulting services being provided by the E Street Group, noting with a raised eyebrow that her husband's firm made more money from her campaign than 15 of her actual employees put together. Down in Louisiana, Kennedy noted, when we pay someone $3 million, we generally expect to see something more than a few digital strategy memos. Is the math different in Minnesota, or do y'all just have more generous donors? The senator's interrogation moved with the slow, inevitable force of a hurricane, grinding down the defense of complex consulting until only the raw bone of nepotism remained. He pointed out the specific timeline of payments, April 2018, noting that this was a period when both Omar and Minette were still legally married to other people. He spoke of the divorce filings where Minette's ex-wife had literally named Omar as the other woman. Kennedy's voice remained sweet as honey as he summarized the arrangement, hiring a future husband's firm, funding an affair with donor money, and then marrying the beneficiary of those millions. He characterized her campaign not as a political movement, but as a family-run ATM, where economic justice for the masses meant economic enrichment for her own household. Omar's face began to flush a deep, telltale red as she realized her identity shield was useless against the cold, hard weight of paper. She tried to interrupt, claiming the payments were for comprehensive services, but Kennedy held up a finger, silencing her instantly. He pulled out a specific expense report for a $47,000 travel consultation for a single trip to California. He mocked the cost, noting that a simple man like himself could fly coach for a few $100s. He informed her that the American people were tired of being lectured on privilege by people who treat their campaigns like a personal piggy bank. The Kennedy reckoning was no longer a threat. It was a reality. As he concluded the first section of the hearing, Kennedy leaned forward, his bifocals sliding to the tip of his nose. He told the room that the Congresswoman had set the tone by questioning his education, so he would return the favor by providing her with a masterclass in accountability. He closed the first folder with a definitive snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent chamber. He looked at the cameras, then back at Omar, his expression one of cold finality. He announced that the masterclass was moving from the spreadsheet to the marriage bed, and that the documentation was just getting started. The gallery sat in a state of stunned silence. Even the squad members looked uncomfortable, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of Kennedy's relentless precision. Kennedy took a slow sip of water, the glass clinking against the table like the final tick of a clock. He had successfully stripped away her first layer of armor, the facade of the ethical reformer. He looked at the next tab in the file, labeled The Elmi Mystery, and the room held its breath. The lion had finished his opening moves, and the prey was already bleeding. The simple Southern boy was just getting warmed up, and the accordion file still had 36 pages of receipts left to share. Every camera in the room was fixed on Omar, whose nuanced defense was already beginning to look like a desperate retreat. Kennedy's smile was gone now, replaced by a grim determination to see the truth through to its bitter end. He wasn't just investigating a representative, he was exposing a fraud that went to the very heart of the American system. The anatomy of the kill zone was complete, and the primary witness was the only person who didn't know she was already a political ghost. If the first hour of the hearing was a clinical dissection of a bank account, the second hour felt like an exhumation. Senator John Kennedy reached for a section of his accordion file bound in a deep, bruised purple. a color that seemed to signal the transition from white-collar oversight to the darker, more tangled geography of a life lived in a hall of mirrors. The simple Southern lawyer persona had now fully morphed into that of a relentless grand jury prosecutor. He began not with a question, but with an observation about the nature of the legal record, noting that in a republic of laws, a signature on a government document isn't a narrative choice. It is a binding reality. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to descend into the twisted genealogical labyrinth of Ilhan Omar's domestic history, a subject she had spent years branding as a racist conspiracy theory. And he started the assault by projecting a massive clinical timeline onto the monitors. It was a visual map of a domestic life that seemed to defy the standard laws of mathematics and human logic. Kennedy's voice, now vibrating with a low, dangerous hum, traced the year 2002. He spoke of the religious ceremony that bound Omar to Ahmed Hirsi, a union that produced children and a public-facing image of traditional stability. However, he noted with a sharp, mocking tilt of his head that there was no legal marriage license to be found in any county office. To the simple mind of a Louisiana lawyer, he mused, a marriage without a license isn't a legal union. It's a performance. He moved his laser pointer along the timeline to 2008, when a divorce was announced to the community, a legal impossibility for a couple that was never legally wed in the eyes of the state. Then came the year 2009, and with it, the name that turned the atmosphere in the chamber from tense to electric, Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Kennedy didn't use the word incest or scandal immediately. He used the word documentation. He invited the Congresswoman to join him in his folksy confusion as he displayed birth records, school registration forms, and immigration filings from the United Kingdom that suggested, with a statistical probability approaching absolute certainty, that the man Ilhan Omar had legally married in 2009 was, in fact, her biological brother. The murmurs in the room were silenced by the sound of Kennedy slapping a certified copy of a Somali birth record onto the desk. He pointed out the shared father's name, the shared households in childhood photographs, and the school records that listed both Elmi and Omar under the same parental guardianship. He spoke of the social media posts from her early career, photos where she referred to Elmi with the casual affection of a sibling, posts that had mysteriously vanished into the digital ether the moment her political star began to rise. Kennedy's interrogation moved with the relentless, grinding force of a tectonic plate. He turned his attention to the years between 2009 and 2017, a period he described as a masterclass in legal acrobatics. He produced tax records that showed Omar was living with and filing joint tax returns with Ahmed Hirsi, the man she was not legally married to, while she was still legally married to Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. He noted that the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board had already caught her in this nuanced web, forcing her to pay back taxes and penalties for married filing jointly status with a man who wasn't her legal husband. He mocked her defense that this was a simple filing error, pointing out that even a simple Southern hick understands that you cannot claim a tax benefit for a husband you don't legally have while being legally bound to a different man who lives in London. The senator leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator who has already felt the first drop of blood. He spoke of the 5-year prison sentence and the mandatory deportation that accompany a conviction for federal immigration fraud. He laid out the motive with surgical precision. Elmi needed a legal status in the United States. Omar, a citizen, provided it through a marriage of convenience, or, more accurately, a marriage of consanguinity. He noted that the divorce from Elmi was finalized just months before she launched her bid for the state legislature, a piece of convenient timing that he suggested was designed to scrub the record before the vetting process could begin. He characterized her domestic history not as a personal struggle, but as a fraudulent enterprise designed to manipulate the American immigration system for the benefit of her family. Kennedy then addressed her reflexive defense, the claim that any inquiry into her marriage was a product of Islamophobia or racism. He mocked the idea that the law is a bigot for demanding consistency. He told her that his simple mind found it fascinating that she viewed her identity as a get-out-of-jail-free card for tax fraud and perjury. He produced a letter from a former neighbor in Minneapolis, someone who had watched the comings and goings of her household for years, who confirmed that the legal husband, Elmi, was never a resident of the home, while the unmarried partner, Hirsi, never left. He characterized her life as a fiction written in the ink of public records, and he informed her that the American people were no longer willing to be called hateful for believing their own eyes. One of the most devastating moments of this section occurred when Kennedy discussed the impact of her actions on the legal immigrant community. He spoke of the thousands of people waiting years for a green card, following every rule and filing every form with meticulous honesty. He contrasted their struggle with her documented shortcut, suggesting that she had used the very system she claimed to be reforming as her own personal playground. He characterized her actions as a slap in the face to every legal immigrant who respects our laws, and he accused her of devaluing the concept of citizenship by treating it as a commodity to be bartered among relatives. He told her that in Louisiana, they have a word for people who cheat their way to the front of the line, and that word wasn't nuanced. As he began to wind down the section on the Elmi marriage, Kennedy didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man delivering a final, unavoidable verdict. He told her that she had spent her career lecturing Americans on their systemic flaws, while she was busy building a system of her own that operated entirely outside the law. He informed her that the marriage labyrinth had finally reached a dead end. He stated that the receipts in his file, the birth certificates, the tax returns, the vanished tweets, were the only witnesses that mattered. He accused her of using her sophistication to hide a level of corruption that would make a back-alley swindler blush. The senator took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the glass clinking against the mahogany table like a final metallic punctuation mark. He had successfully dismantled her financial integrity and now her personal history. He looked at the cameras, his expression one of cold finality. He announced that the masterclass in accountability was moving from the marriage bed to the national graveyard. He closed the purple folder with a definitive, heavy thud, signaling that the personal mask had been torn away, and the ideological mask was next. The gallery sat in a state of stunned silence as Kennedy reached for the next section of the file, the one labeled "The Ghost of 9/11." And the simple Southern boy prepared to deliver a blow that would resonate far beyond the hearing room. He paused for a long moment, letting the weight of the marriage fraud documentation settle into the air like dust in a tomb. He noted that the tragedy of her career was that she believed she was too important to be honest. He reminded her that the United States is a country where the truth doesn't care about your Twitter followers or your squad memberships. As he reached for the final tab of this section, he smiled. That slow, terrifying smile of a man who knows the execution is already halfway complete. The documentation was total, the labyrinth was mapped, and the final reckoning was inevitable. The atmosphere in the hearing room didn't just grow heavy, it became hallowed. Senator John Kennedy pushed the purple marriage folder aside and reached for a binder bound in a deep funereal black. The transition was abrupt and visceral. While the previous hour had been a clinical autopsy of her private life, this was an exhumation of a national open wound. Kennedy's demeanor shifted. The mocking glint in his eyes was replaced by the cold blue fire of a man defending a sacred text. He spoke of the morning of September 11th not as a historical data point, but as a defining trauma that etched the American identity in fire and ash. He adjusted his glasses, leaning into the microphone with a stillness that commanded the absolute silence of the gallery. He opened the binder and began not with a question, but with an echo. From the high-quality speakers in the room, a recording of Omar's own voice began to play. A clip from a 2019 Care fundraiser. The sound of her voice, airy and dismissive, filled the chamber. Some people did something. Kennedy stopped the recording and let the phrase hang in the air like a foul scent. He didn't repeat it immediately. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of high-definition 8x10 photographs, holding them up one by one with a slow, agonizing deliberation that felt like a funeral procession. These weren't photos of the towers falling. They were photos of the people who never came home. He held up a portrait of Captain Patrick Brown of the FDNY, a man who charged into a furnace while the world was running for the exits. He showed the face of Wells Crowther, the young hero in the red bandana. He showed the portrait of Todd Beamer, whose final command, "Let's roll," became the first act of the American resistance. "Tell me, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated through the floorboards, "in your sophisticated world of global complexity, are these men just some people? Is the act of flying a commercial airliner into a skyscraper filled with office workers just doing something?" He didn't wait for an answer, nor did he expect one. He characterized her rhetoric not as a linguistic slip, but as a deliberate act of moral sanitization. He argued that she was more concerned with protecting the image of the perpetrators than honoring the sacrifice of the victims. He accused her of treating the greatest tragedy in American history as an inconvenient PR hurdle for her ideological brand. Kennedy then pivoted with the force of a swinging blade toward her legislative record, transforming the emotional weight of his argument into the cold reality of federal policy. He produced a series of glowing charts that tracked her consistent pattern of shielding radical organizations from scrutiny. He highlighted her persistent opposition to designating certain extremist groups as terrorists, her votes against counterterrorism funding, and her bizarre lone wolf refusal to recognize the Armenian genocide, a move he suggested was a strategic gift to her autocratic friends in Turkey. He characterized her foreign policy as a selective moral outrage, where she saved her loudest condemnations for American allies while providing sophisticated cover for regimes that hang dissidents from cranes. The senator's tone became bitingly satirical as he addressed her reflexive pivot to Islamophobia whenever she was asked to explain her comments. He mocked the idea that she, a woman holding one of the most powerful offices in the world, was the victim in this scenario. He told her that his simple Southern mind struggled to understand how someone could claim to be oppressed by a country that had given her a seat at the table of power. He characterized her use of the victim card as a form of stolen valor, suggesting she was wrapping herself in a cloak of persecution to avoid answering for her own documented contempt for the nation's collective memory. He informed her that the American people weren't Islamophobic for being outraged. They were just American-philic, and they expected their representatives to share that love. As he began to wind down the section on 9/11, Kennedy didn't look triumphant. He looked profoundly weary. He told her that he had met with the families of the victims, people who still have empty chairs at their Thanksgiving tables because some people did something. He read a letter from a 9/11 widow who asked why a woman who refuses to name the evil that killed her husband is allowed to sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He characterized her presence in that room as an ongoing insult to the dead, and he informed her that the masterclass in accountability had finally reached the heart of her betrayal. He stated that the receipts in his binder, the transcripts, the votes, the letters from the grieving, were an indictment that no amount of nuance could ever overturn. Kennedy closed the black binder with a definitive, heavy thud, signaling that the ideological mask had been shattered. He paused for a long moment, letting the weight of the 9/11 photographs settle into the air. He noted that the tragedy of her career was that she had been given a voice to honor the fallen, and she had chosen to spit on their memory instead. He reminded her that the United States is a country that never forgets, even if its representatives find it convenient to do so. Kennedy didn't reach for his water this time. Instead, he reached for a small silver digital recorder that had been sitting quietly beside his accordion file. He didn't wait for the room to settle or for the cameras to refocus. He simply pressed a button. A voice, unmistakably Omar's but speaking in a sharp, rapid-fire Somali, filled the chamber. Even those who didn't understand the language could hear the change in her tone. Gone was the measured, nuanced congresswoman, replaced by a fiery orator speaking to a room of her own. Kennedy waited for the clip to end, then held up a document with a bright blue seal. "That was January of last year, for those of y'all keepin' track at home," he drawled, his voice now low and clinical. "And this here is the certified translation provided by 3 independent linguists who don't have a dog in this hunt." He didn't read the whole thing. He simply highlighted one sentence that seemed to suck the remaining air out of the room. "We are people who know they are Somali and Muslim first." He looked at Omar, his eyes not mocking, but cold and inquisitive. "Now, Congresswoman, I'm just a simple lawyer from a state that still believes in the oath of office. When you stood on that House floor and put your hand on a book, you swore solemn allegiance to the United States. I've been looking at the dictionary and I can't find a version of allegiance that allows for a partition. You can't be first for 2 different countries at the same time. It's a bit like trying to sit on 2 chairs with only one backside. Eventually, you're going to end up on the floor." He moved with the speed of a predator, pulling out a set of legislative trackers. He pointed to her consistent, aggressive lobbying for unmonitored foreign aid to the Somali government, a regime she referred to as ours in her native tongue, while simultaneously voting to gut the very American defense budgets that provide global stability. He characterized her presence on the Foreign Affairs Committee not as a voice for Minnesota, but as a high-level infiltration by a foreign interest. He argued that she was effectively a dual representative, cashing a check from the American taxpayer while serving a constituency located 4,000 miles across the Atlantic. Kennedy's interrogation then pivoted to her frequent, high-level excursions to Qatar and Turkey. He displayed a web of travel records on the monitors, showing her meeting with autocrats like Erdogan with a warmth she never extended to the leadership of her own country. He noted with a sharp, predatory smile that these trips were often funded by shadowy NGOs with deep ties to foreign ministries. He characterized this as legalized shadow diplomacy, asking the room if it was sophisticated or merely treasonous for a member of Congress to act as a private emissary for regimes that actively work to undermine American strategic interests. The senator then pulled out a document that seemed to weigh more than all the foreign transcripts combined. It was a translated speech from a Somali diaspora event where she assured her audience that the state of Minnesota is us. It is ours. He dissected the territorial nature of her language, suggesting that she viewed her congressional district not as a vibrant part of the American melting pot, but as a colonized outpost for her primary culture. He characterized her brand of multiculturalism as a front for tribalism, where American resources were merely tools to be leveraged in foreign power struggles. One of the most devastating moments of this section occurred when Kennedy addressed the impact of her rhetoric on the Somali-American community itself. He read a letter from a Somali refugee in her district, a veteran who had served in the U.S. Army. The letter was a cry of profound betrayal. When she tells the world she is Somali first, she makes every one of us look like a Trojan horse. She makes our neighbors doubt us. Kennedy's voice remained steady as he noted that this veteran understood the meaning of the word American far better than the woman sitting in the witness chair. He accused her of using her community as a shield to hide a private agenda of foreign allegiance. The simple Southern boy then turned his attention to her voting record regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran. He produced a chart showing her consistent, unwavering opposition to any security measure that strengthened American allies in the Middle East. He characterized her foreign policy as systematically anti-Western, noting that her sophisticated nuance always seemed to favor the very regimes that burned the American flag in their streets. He told the room that she was the only member of Congress whose voting record could be mistaken for a briefing paper from a hostile foreign ministry. Kennedy leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk. The theatrics were over. This was the final summation of the Somali First file. He told her that she had been given the greatest gift a refugee could receive, a seat at the table of the most powerful democracy in history. He accused her of using that seat to try and saw the legs off the table. He stated that the receipts in his file, the translated videos, the travel ledgers, the voting patterns, were an indictment of a career spent serving two masters and loving only one. The senator didn't sip his water. He didn't pause for dramatic effect. He simply closed the blue folder with a sharp final click of the binder rings. He looked at the chairman and announced that the Kennedy reckoning was now moving into its most explosive phase. The documented history of her rhetoric regarding the Jewish people. He informed the room that the global citizen mask had been torn away, leaving only the wreckage of a representative who had forgotten which country she swore to protect. The documentation was total, the foreign web was exposed, and the reckoning was unstoppable. Without a word of transition, Kennedy swapped the blue folder for a section of his accordion file labeled with a single sharp word: tropes. The shift in the room was palpable. If the previous sections had been about money and loyalty, this was about the weaponization of prejudice. Kennedy's voice took on a rhythmic, biting clarity, as if he were reading a bill of attainder from the 18th century. He spoke of the danger of words, noting that in the hands of a leader, language can either be a bridge or a torch. He began by projecting a digital ghost onto the screens, a tweet from 2012 that Omar had once believed was safely buried. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Kennedy let the word hypnotized linger in the air like a foul scent. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he used a tone of exaggerated academic curiosity, dwelling on the syllable as if he were dissecting a parasite. He noted that the concept of hypnotic Jewish power, the idea of a sinister mystical influence, was a staple of 20th century genocidal propaganda. "Now, Congresswoman," he mused, "I know you're a big fan of nuance, but down in Louisiana, we call this hateful nonsense. I'm wondering how a sophisticated world traveler like yourself just happens to stumble into the exact vocabulary of history's greatest monsters. Is that a coincidence, or is it just the way you think when the cameras aren't on?" Kennedy then pivoted to the infamous Benjamin's incident. He held up a transcript of the exchange where Omar had suggested that American support for Israel was strictly a matter of financial bribery. Kennedy's laughter was a dry, rattling sound. He pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of a woman who had just been caught funneling millions into her husband's firm, now lecturing the world about the corrupting influence of money. He characterized this as projection, where her own documented financial irregularities were mirrored in her accusations against others. The senator's interrogation grew even more relentless as he produced a series of charts displaying the rise in anti-Semitic incidents in her own region. He read a heart-wrenching letter from a mother in Minneapolis who spoke of her daughter being bullied in school with the very tropes Omar had mainstreamed. Kennedy's voice thickened with a rare, cold anger as he told the Congresswoman that words from a person in power are not just tweets. They are the moral climate in which children are raised. He accused her of using her seat in Congress to provide a respectable face for an ancient hatred. He concluded this section by addressing her consistent comparisons of the United States to the Taliban and Hamas. He spoke of the profound moral rot required to equate a sovereign democracy that protects rights with a group of terrorists who use children as human shields. He characterized her activism as a Trojan horse, a way to smuggle ancient hatreds into the halls of American power. Kennedy stated that the receipts in his file, the tweets, the rising crime stats, the letters from the Jewish community, were an indictment of a moral failure that no amount of nuance could cover. The rustle of the next section of Kennedy's file sounded like the dry rattling of a snake. This folder was metallic gray, embossed with the seals of international monitoring agencies. As Kennedy adjusted his glasses, the atmosphere shifted from moral indignation to the cold air of an espionage briefing. He began by speaking of the Logan Act and the principle that the United States speaks to the world with one voice, not through the rogue back channels of individual representatives. He projected a complex digital map onto the monitors, a network of glowing nodes tracing her extensive travels to Doha, Ankara, and Islamabad. Kennedy's voice, now carrying the precision of a ticking time bomb, noted that while her colleagues were visiting military bases, her itinerary looked like a tour of regimes that view American influence as a disease. He pointed his laser toward Qatar, musing about her frequent visits to a kingdom that serves as a sanctuary for the leadership of Hamas. Kennedy then pulled out a stack of financial disclosures cross-referenced with flight manifests. He pointed out that these trips were rarely funded by the American taxpayer, but by a labyrinth of non-profits with deep ties to foreign governments. He characterized this as legalized foreign influence, where autocrats paid for first-class luxury in exchange for a sympathetic voice on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He asked her if she was effectively a walking billboard for foreign interests, trading American strategic secrets for five-star hotel stays. The senator's attention then pivoted to her meeting with President Erdogan. He displayed a photo of the encounter, highlighting the collegial body language. He spoke of the irony of a champion of the marginalized sitting down with a man who has crushed Kurdish dissent and imprisoned journalists. Kennedy noted that shortly after this meeting, Omar became one of the few to vote against recognizing the Armenian genocide. He didn't call it a bribe. He called it a remarkable alignment of interests that always favored the regimes currently hosting her. Kennedy's interrogation grew even more pointed as he discussed her rogue mission to Kashmir. He noted that she had bypassed the State Department, conducting shadow diplomacy that undermined American partnerships. He characterized her as a useful tool for regimes that relish seeing an American official disparaging their own country from a foreign podium. He asked her if her nuanced understanding included the realization that she was being used as a pawn in a geopolitical chess game. He concluded this section by highlighting her voting record regarding Iran. He produced a chart showing her consistent opposition to any security measure that strengthened American allies. He characterized her foreign policy as systematically anti-Western, suggesting that her sophisticated nuance always seemed to favor the very regimes that burned the American flag. Kennedy stated that the American people were tired of representatives who treated foreign capitals like a second home and foreign autocrats like business partners. The resonance of Senator Kennedy's voice underwent a fundamental shift as he moved away from the high-stakes theater of international espionage. He pushed aside the sleek, metallic binders and reached for a folder that was dog-eared and worn, filled with the humble artifacts of everyday life. Letters written on lined notebook paper, printed emails with local footers, and grainy clippings from the Star Tribune. The simple Southern lawyer was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he was about to deliver a eulogy for a community that had been forgotten in the pursuit of global celebrity. He spoke of the sacred compact between a representative and their constituents, a promise that the person sent to Washington would be a shield for the neighborhood, not a brand for the world. He began this indictment by projecting a split-screen image onto the monitors. On the left was a glamorous shot of Omar at a high-fashion gala in New York. On the right was a boarded-up small business in the heart of Minneapolis, spray-painted with the scars of the 2000 unrest. Kennedy didn't say a word for several seconds, letting the visual disparity settle into the conscience of the room. "Now, Congresswoman," he began, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone, "I've been looking at your calendar. It's filled with late-night talk shows and foreign summits. But I've also been looking at the streets of the 5th District, and it looks to me like you've traded the snows of Minnesota for the spotlights of Hollywood." He pulled the first letter from the folder with a reverence he hadn't shown to any financial ledger. He read the words of a woman named Maria, a 67-year-old grandmother who had lived in the same neighborhood for 4 decades. Her letter wasn't about global complexity or systemic theory. It was about a grandson who couldn't walk to the local park because of the sound of gunfire. She wrote of calling Omar's office 23 times to ask for help with a basic housing issue, only to be met with a cold, automated reply. Kennedy's voice grew thick with a quiet, controlled anger as he read her final sentence. "I see my congresswoman on TV every night defending people halfway across the world. But to her, I have become invisible." He asked Omar if her global perspective was so wide that it simply skipped over the elderly woman living 3 blocks from her district office. The senator then produced a stack of testimonials from local shopkeepers, many of them Somali and Ethiopian immigrants, who had seen their life's work destroyed during the riots that Omar had famously characterized as a cry for justice. He spoke of a man who had saved for 20 years to open a grocery store, only to have it looted while his representative tweeted about dismantling the police. Kennedy noted the bitter irony of a champion of the marginalized, ignoring the very marginalized people who were trying to build the American dream through sweat and capital. He characterized her leadership as ideological arson, where she was perfectly willing to let her own district burn if the smoke provided a better backdrop for a national media appearance. He moved his finger toward a chart showing the dramatic spike in violent crime within her district, juxtaposed against her public calls to defund law enforcement. He mocked the luxury of her position, noting that while she sat behind a wall of private security funded by wealthy donors from California and New York, her constituents were left to fend for themselves in a city where the police force had been hollowed out by her rhetoric. He asked her if the nuance of her policy positions ever covered the cost of a funeral for a child caught in the crossfire of the crime wave she helped facilitate. He accused her of being an absentee landlord of a representative, someone who collected the political rent but never bothered to fix the roof. One of the most devastating blows of this section occurred when Kennedy addressed the education gap. He produced records showing that while she was busy debating the geopolitics of the Horn of Africa, the literacy rates in her district's public schools were plummeting. He spoke of parents who felt abandoned by a representative who was more interested in radical theory than in ensuring children could read at grade level. He characterized her focus as a betrayal of the future, suggesting she was preparing the next generation for a life of grievance rather than a life of opportunity. He informed her that the people of the 5th District weren't props for her social media brand. They were human beings with real problems that she had deemed too simple for her sophisticated attention. The final section of the accordion file was bound in a heavy, reinforced black cover. This was the part of the hearing where the nuance of politics died, and the cold, unyielding reality of the law took over. Senator Kennedy didn't look at the cameras now. He looked at Omar with the clinical detachment of a judge about to read a verdict. He spoke of the House Ethics Manual as the moral spine of the institution, a set of rules designed to ensure that public service isn't a shortcut to private wealth. He adjusted his bifocals, his eyes taking on a flinty sheen as he prepared to lay out the specific, documented violations that turned her office into a family-run enterprise. He started by addressing the personal use of campaign funds. Kennedy's voice, now carrying the rhythmic cadence of a grand jury prosecutor, pulled out internal ledger entries subpoenaed from her husband's firm, the E Street Group. He pointed to a $45,000 travel reimbursement for a trip that coincided with their honeymoon. He mused aloud about the sheer audacity of charging the American donor, the schoolteacher in Minneapolis, or the retiree in Duluth for romantic getaways under the guise of political consulting. He characterized this as a systematic skimming operation, designed to maintain a lifestyle that her official salary could never support. He told her that in Louisiana, they have a word for people who use other people's money to pay for their own vacations, and that word wasn't progressive. Kennedy then pulled out a formal memo from the House Ethics Committee flagging the illegal use of campaign funds to pay for personal legal fees related to her multiple divorces. He mocked her defense that these were politically motivated expenses. He spoke of the fines she had been forced to pay, comparing them to a bank robber being asked to return the pens he stole from the lobby while keeping the vault. He informed the room that a token fine was not a clearance of guilt, but a warning shot that she had arrogantly chosen to ignore. He then moved to the gift rule violations, listing luxury items and designer clothing donated by foreign interest groups that had never appeared on her disclosure forms. He characterized her financial filings as works of creative fiction designed to hide a web of patronage. The simple country lawyer then delivered the most lethal blow of the day, the conflict of interest statutes. He produced a series of emails between her senior staff and her husband's principals, showing a direct coordination of billing that bypassed all oversight. He pointed to evidence of double-dipping, where travel expenses were reimbursed by both her campaign and the House of Representatives for the very same trips. He characterized this as a fraudulent loop, a way to extract maximum cash from the system while leaving a paper trail so complex she assumed no one would ever untangle it. "Now, Congresswoman," he drawled, "even a simple Southern hick can see that you've been treating the halls of Congress like a conveyor belt for personal enrichment." He concluded the hearing by addressing the Code of Official Conduct and the requirement that members reflect creditably on the House. He spoke of the shame she had brought to the institution through her disregard for the rules. He characterized her defense that the rules were racist or outdated as a desperate attempt to create an ethical exemption for herself. He told her that the law does not care about her identity, it cares about her integrity, and in her case, The receipts showed that the cupboard was bare. He informed her that his findings were already being reviewed by federal agencies and that the masterclass in accountability was now moving from the committee room to the courtroom. Kennedy leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling finality. He spoke of the fall from grace, suggesting that the higher one climbs on the ladder of identity politics, the harder they hit the ground when the truth pulls the ladder away. He stated that the American people were tired of the smug sense of entitlement that allowed her to lecture them on morality while she was breaking the law behind their backs. He closed the final folder with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed like a final verdict through the silent chamber. The senator took one final, slow sip of water, the clink of the glass against the table sounding like the final strike of a clock. He looked at the cameras, then back at Omar, his expression one of cold, unyielding judgment. He announced that the master class was over. Omar stood abruptly, her face a mask of frozen fury, and made a silent, rapid exit through the side door as the gallery erupted into a mixture of stunned murmurs and applause. The simple Southern boy had finished the job, the receipts were total, and the political career of Ilhan Omar was officially a matter of history.